So today I wanted to talk about navigating chaos. In the gospel story that we just read, the earlier part of it is that a furious swell came up and the waves broke over the boat, and so it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion, and the disciples woke him and said, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" And Jesus calms the storm by simply saying, "Be still." As I've mentioned, many people have been coming to me lately feeling they're in a storm of chaos, primarily since the inauguration, particularly here in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. There's been a lot of upheaval. Government agencies are being shut down, employees face uncertainty, and each day brings new challenges. And just this last week, one of the folks that I talked to shared the questions that she was having and she's grappling with. And she was asking things like, well, do I serve the American people or this president who doesn't seem to value my role? If I accept a buyout, would it even be honored? Is this the moment I leave my job, which I've always been very proud of? Or is this even a time I leave my country? So these are the sort of questions that I'm hearing from a variety of different sources. That was just one person. But these are very good people with very real concerns. And what they're trying to do is navigate the chaos. And if you think about it, particularly for people who work for the government, many people choose that career because it's considered small c conservative, meaning it's pretty steady, it's pretty reliable, you're not going to have to deal with a lot of turnover and change and so forth. So it's particularly, I think, disruptive for people who chose that career path for that reason. So while there is merit in reevaluating government structures and finding government waste and seeing if agencies should be around or not, I think that's all valuable. The abrupt change without compassion has really created some turmoil. And it's moments like this that I think we seek our faith to anchor ourselves in the storm. All of us face different periods of chaos or the storm, not just people facing what's going on with our government, but we face it, and we face it on a pretty regular basis. We've been in a time and a period in our country. If you just think about it, I was just thinking the other day, well, we had 9/11 at the beginning of the century, and then we had economic collapse period, and then we had a pandemic, and we've had polarization politically between the two political parties. So there's a sense of exhaustion for a lot of people. They've been through a lot. And I remember talking to one young person, Gen Z, and they said, "Oh, well, our life, everything has always been so chaotic. Nothing's been normal." And I thought for a minute and I tried to think of an example in their young life. And I said, "Well, what did you make of the Obama years? Were you excited about that?" And they said, "I wasn't really born much in the Obama years." So in their young life, everything has been very, very chaotic, very politically back and forth. And that's created a culture that's quite anxious right now. And so in this period of chaos, it's important to look to our faith tradition to see what we can learn. One of the first things we learn in our tradition is that there's no escaping chaos. Okay? Being spiritual or having faith, it doesn't get you out of chaos. Chaos will be, we are told, a regular part of our lives. In fact, it's necessary for our spiritual growth. And it offers us a time to develop spiritual practices that cultivate inner peace. Now, Swedenborg talks about disorder this way. He said that divine order is present even when there appears to be disorder. So even though the world can seem very disordered from our perspective, we're comforted, I think, to know that there's a divine order that's at work. There will be times when we see chaos, but we can remind ourselves that our loving God is working a divine order in the midst of it. The disorder that we see that appears as chaos is actually necessary for things to be reset and regenerated. So if chaos is a reality of life and the divine order is also a reality, how do we accept both of those in our lives? How do we accept both chaos and knowing there's order? How do we balance that? And how do we accept chaos and then accept God's in control? For me, the real question is, how can I be sure I'm aligning myself with the divine love and wisdom, the divine order in the midst of the chaos? I like to think of it myself as an image of floating down a river, that I'm in the divine flow. I'm doing my best to be in the divine flow. I'm trying to align myself to the divine flow, but there will be rapids. There'll be rocks. Hopefully I have my feet going down first, and there'll be bumps and tussles, but I feel like I'm in the flow. Now, one way we can look at chaos is to examine what the chaos brings up for us and how we can harness it for good. And as I looked at it, I looked at primarily three areas of chaos that I saw in my own life. Maybe you see more, maybe less, but three: personal chaos, social chaos, and spiritual chaos. So I want to quickly just look at those types of chaos and see what role we play in either turning them toward good or spiraling down into fear and anxiety. The first is personal chaos, and that's the one that I find that in my own life is the one where I do spiral into more fear and anxiety. It's when we immerse ourselves in distressing news, distressing social media, and we begin to tell ourselves very horrible stories. And we begin to believe that by worrying about things, we're showing our commitment to them. When in reality, that worrying and anxiety can paralyze us. And we come to often believe that our fear that we're having is going to protect us, but very often it leaves us more divided. You know, I've been doing these trainings about how we can see different perspectives. And in it, I ask very often folks, if you have a choice between contempt or compassion for people who you disagree with, that you're having, a chaotic relationship with, what do you choose? And so many of the people have told me they choose contempt, which I appreciate their honesty. And when I've dug deeper into the discussions, I found that there's a belief that contempt is like a talisman, that if we hold on to it, we're fighting the enemy and we're showing our loyalty to what's good. So contempt for others can actually makes us stronger and better. And just the opposite happens. We get into more anxiety, more stress, and we're unhelpful to others. I find in my own life, I also seek to steer the world in my direction by overcommitting myself. So I'll think, oh, I can solve this if I just do this, this, and this. But constantly trying to be a hero is exhausting too, and it makes us ineffective. It's not strategic. Strategic is to align to the divine order and recognize that there will be chaos. That's at the personal level. Now, at the social level, we see something very similar. The social level of chaos is more the political strife, injustice, social fragmentation. Our relationships suffer when this rises. We become more divided, and when we allow anger and judgment to rule, we lose sight of the shared humanity we have with everyone else. And again, we often choose the contempt over compassion, and we just feel good about being right against the people who are wrong, that are creating the chaos, not us. And we don't look within. And again, this tends to end with chaos and more exhaustion. We feel just really worn out. The third area of chaos is more spiritual chaos. And that I find is when we live in constant anxiety and we exhaust ourselves in our relationships, generally spiritual chaos follows. We begin to doubt God's presence. We feel abandoned. We're a bit like the disciples in the boat. We ask to God, don't you care about us? What question we ask? We question our faith, And we wonder, are we strong enough to withstand the storm? So those are some of the examples of how we can either play into chaos or we can try to navigate chaos. Um, what are some practical strategies that we could use when we feel those moments when we feel like we're being pulled into the storm, under the water? Now, I remember I started attending Church of the Holy City in the late 90s under the Reverend Jonathan Mitchell. And each Sunday, he invited the congregation into a circle for prayer. It was a small group. And he'd begin the words of the prayer with the psalm that we read today from Psalm 46. And he'd break it into three parts. He'd say, "Be still and know that I am God." Then he would say, "Be still and know." And then finally, he'd say, "Be still." And I always thought that was a very beautiful way. I think it's a lovely mantra for us to hang on to for ourselves when we feel that the world is chaotic and we're not in control. Just to say to ourselves that psalm, "Be still and know that I am God." Be still and know. Be still. And this is not an invitation to ignore the world's problems, but a reminder to recognize the divine order working behind the scenes. And we can only really experience that or gain direct connection to it when we're still, not chaotic ourselves. Now, rather than seeing chaos as something that we fear, we can also get curious. I often ask myself, how is God working for good in this situation? And I look back on my life and I see these great periods of disruption in the culture and disruption in my personal life. And I look back and say, wow, those were the moments that led to transformation and growth. So the divine order was working. I couldn't see it at the time, but I can see it in retrospect. I use that to remind myself that it's very likely, if I live many more years, that I'll look back at this time right now and say, wow, those were great years. That was a great moment. And instead of appreciating it later, we can stop and have gratitude for where we are now. The gospel story today about the storm, it represents that eternal, external chaos can overwhelm us. But we don't find true peace by avoiding storms, but we do by commanding them with faith and trust in God. His presence reassures us that even in turmoil, we can find stability through our faith. The Swedenborgian wisdom encourages us to shift from external chaos to focusing on inner peace by examining our role in the turmoil. We can ask ourselves, when we're feeling the chaos, are we clinging to control instead of trusting God? That's a big one for me. Are we holding on to false attachments as false security? Are we clinging to a desire to be right? Are we hanging on to a fear, thinking that it will protect us? Navigating chaos is about moving from the disorder to divine order in our lives. So, how can we shift in that today? How can we make that shift toward divine order? Well, here are three practical suggestions. One is regeneration, which is the word we use for spiritual growth, and that's transforming the inner chaos. When we experience chaos, it's often a signal that God is calling us to a higher state. Instead of resisting, we can ask, what lesson is being offered to me at this moment? If you think about it right now in your life, you can take one area that's chaotic in your life right now, and you can just take that one area and say, God, I seek your order in this. A good example for me in my life is overcommitting myself. What I was talking about earlier, like heroing situation. But you have something in your life where you can feel the chaos. Invite God's order into it. A second strategy is being useful. serving others even amidst uncertainty. For me, one of the quickest ways to find stability in chaos is to shift my focus from being all about myself to what can I do for others. Rather than dwelling on what's wrong, we can ask, where can I be useful? Small acts of kindness and service anchor us in divine order. Third, seeing the bigger picture. And by that I mean trusting in divine providence. We read the quote from Swedenborg today, all things, even the smallest, are under divine providence. And likewise, Paul reminds us, all things work together for the good who love God. When life feels chaotic, we can choose to trust God's long-term plan. Even in uncertainty, we can find peace knowing that God's at work. So I encourage you now in these times of chaos to get curious, and play a game with yourself and even say, I wonder how these things that I'm seeing right now can work out to the good for those who serve God. What good can be happening now? Just be curious. You don't have to be right or wrong, just be curious. So this week, try the shift from embracing and being pulled into the chaos and shift into order. At the personal level, we can ask God, what interchange do I need to make? At the community level, we can ask, how can I help bring peace and calm to someone else's chaos this week? And the third is the spiritual practice of when you feel overwhelmed, we can try this mantra, be still and know that I am God. Be still and know. Be still. If you can't remember the whole thing, just say to yourself, be still. Amen. Any questions, comments? Malcolm?
Well, I suppose old people like me have a certain advantage in that having been around so long, we've experienced prior chaos and have survived it. And also, having recently had the great pleasure of researching and writing the history of the church, one can look back to times in the history of our church when great difficulties were surmounted. And doing that gives a certain reassurance, not a guarantee, but a kind of reassurance that we have dealt with difficult things in the past and that we should be able, therefore, to do so in the present.
Mm. Yeah, the wisdom that we get through a life of experience of overcoming periods of chaos and knowing this isn't the end of the world. I know that Cheryl spends a lot of time working with young people in high school and trying to make it into college, usually from difficult situations. And those kids are lucky to have someone like Cheryl, to the point that Malcolm's making, because when you're 16 or 17, you don't have that track record. You don't have the wisdom of going through chaos. So chaos at 16 and 17, 18, 15 can be overwhelming. So I think we have to be particularly careful with young people. And I think we dump a lot on them today about the state of the world and the state of the climate and the state of the government and the state of everything. And I think they're quite overwhelmed. And to Malcolm's point, they don't have that track record. And they may not have a Cheryl in their life. They may not have. So if you have a younger person in your life, a grandchild or a nephew or a niece or a child, whatever, keep that person in mind during these times. They often don't have a track record of coming through chaos. So the chaos can be all consuming. Cheryl?
Good evening, everyone. I so appreciate what Malcolm said, and you said, Rich, and what I'm finding challenging for me, even though I can look back and say we're going to be okay. I think what's been different for me in in helping to reassure young people is it's hard for me to see a way forward. So for me, it's like reassuring them that we're going to get through whatever their challenges are. We're going to make it through, talking about our trust in God and all of that. But then when they ask me a question like, do you see this better? Do you see this different? Do you see what was it like for you? And I've had to contemplate a lot, and I've had this conversation with several people over the last couple of weeks. As many of you know, I grew up in segregation, hard time, really hard time in my life. But this feels so different. And for some reason, for me, it even feels harder. Because I felt then that we had some people that stood up for right and stood up for those who were um, not being treated fairly. This, I feel like there's no control, and this is my feeling, just speaking for myself. So I have to keep myself grounded in my faith, grounded in what I believe, grounded in my experience. So when I have these conversations, and there have been many over the last month and a half, to help them to say, you may not see it now, but if you trust me and you trust God, you'll see that you will get through it. And we will see the blessings and the lessons in it. But this has tested my faith when I've had to share with young people to encourage, and even in my work with federal workers. Sometimes I'm just holding them as they're crying in their session. So this has been hard, but I do have hope. So thank you.
Thank you. And I think you put a point on the state of things today that we're both I think we're both hearing the same conversations. The only thing, one, I don't think it's good to, in the midst of chaos, just to be Pollyanna. Everything's going to work out. Don't worry. I think it's to be honest. And there are major concerns right now. But one thing I do know, just through history, is there tends to be a pendulum. And one voice that we probably wouldn't hear a lot of in this congregation is that a lot of people who were, say, very traditionally evangelical lived in, when you talk to them, over the last, I've talked to them over the years, they were in a state of very much incredible anxiety and fear for their faith. And they were discriminated against minority, that nobody cared about them, and their churches would be taken away from them, and so on and so forth. So they were in a state of fear. And I think that drove some of the behavior that we're experiencing now. And I think there will be a swing in the pendulum again. And that's why I think we don't want to give in to we want to keep our eyes on the prize and not give in to the fear. And because the fear eventually leads to exhaustion, exhaustion eventually leads to being out of the game. And I don't think that's what we're called to do. But it is recognizing, yeah, I could see how those groups could feel that, and maybe I'm experiencing some of what they felt at that time, and this is, um, um, but this is not. I don't think this is permanent. This feeling. That's just my gut. Maybe I'm being naive, but I don't think it's permanent, and I think that I don't think it's where most of the American public is. So that just tells you that things, I think, can have potential of swinging in various directions. And this is an even crazier idea, but the more they swing in a very strong direction, the more people become aware of what what it is. So that's just, I don't know if that's any consolation to you, but that's kind of how I'm looking at how things evolve over time and change. And and I think we have to look at, like, what will be our role in this next period. And I say that as a community. But thank you for being on the front lines of that, Cheryl. Any other questions or comments? Katerina?
I was attending the Ukraine week in Washington this entire week, and we are now at the end of it. And this has been a gathering of 2,000 or 3,000 people, both Ukrainians and Americans, organized by a number of evangelical faith-based groups on both sides of the Atlantic. It's incredible what I saw. On the one hand, yes, many of these people are agreeing with the agenda of the new president. On the other hand, they're also fearful as to what would happen, particularly when it comes to Ukraine. And there were several themes, including prayers, all throughout the week. But the themes that emerged were gratitude and that the problems are big, but God is bigger. And it's almost as bad as things are, there was this unshakable faith that we will pull through it. And it was incredible to watch 3,000 people all pray in unison. Not all Christians, interfaith too, but just extraordinary. So as open-eyed as people are about how big this situation is, and we're at a crisis point if United States is no longer there to help. But there's as big of faith that God will pull through and his great work and mercy will shine through this.
That's another concrete example of trying to find, divine order in the midst of the chaos. One thing we live through as a church community, because we have Ukrainian members, is that we watched as the war against Ukraine was being launched week by week, and we talked about it in church. And I remember people said, the conventional wisdom of every reporter was that this will be about a month at the most. Every reporter said that. And I don't know, I don't understand military weapons and powers and so forth, but everybody said it's over. Okay. And so we prayed about it, and we talked about David and Goliath, and we didn't see a way forward really, but and that was 3 years ago. And so again, getting caught up in the conventional wisdom of the moment and what everybody is telling us is doom and gloom, I find unhelpful. I'm not saying ever be naive, but we have to be wise as serpents and gentle as doves. We also have to look for that other side. And so that's Ukraine is a good example, I think, of I believe that it's a miracle what happened with Ukraine. I don't know how else you can describe it. I still to this day do not understand how Russia did not conquer Ukraine within 6 months. So we'll continue to pray for God's protection for a country that was just ruthlessly attacked. Other questions or comments?
When I'm most afraid, I find these days especially that I just begin to pray. And they're very short prayers, um, just a plea for peace, a plea for safety, and sometimes it's a mantra of 3 or 4 short prayers, 3 or 4 words, and I'll keep on doing that until some of the fear passes, and that helps. That helps me.
Did you, Glenn, did you say that you, when you pray, do you just say a prayer, or do you actually, do you have a certain psalm that you say, or
It's just a short prayer.
just a prayer, just a
Dear
conversation?
God, help. Dear God, help. Come, Lord Jesus. Um, Give us safety. Um, Give me peace.
Beautiful.
Just continual thing. Whatever comes to my mind, I'll say it.
Mhm. Beautiful.
Either in my heart or aloud.
Yeah, I don't think we can underestimate the power of that. And that runs completely against the conventional culture, but I think we can't really underestimate the power of it. Roxanne says, I recommend immersing yourself in beauty. It's a balm for the soul. Do you have any particular type of beauty that you like to engage in, Roxanne?
Well, I can't really respond because the dogs are barking, but
Oh,
whatever you find beautiful, turn to it. Music, art,
yeah,
poetry, whatever it is. So we're got the snow blowers out, so
yeah,
I'm
you're
gonna
storm.
mute.
Great. Anyone else like
It,
to?
uh,
Chris?
Rich, as you were uh,
Chris, you're cutting in and out. It's cutting in and out a
oops,
little bit.
I'm
Can
sorry.
yeah, yeah, can you go right up to the phone?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's better. Go ahead.
I think
No, it's still cutting.
be still. Yes.
Still cutting in and out a little bit.
Well, anyway,
Yeah, it's not coming through, unfortunately.
I'm
Sorry.
sorry.
No, I'm sorry. We always love your wisdom. It's always helpful. So we miss
Yeah.
sometimes technology is not cooperating.
Oh, I was really inspired by Natalia's book of 50 Incredible Incidents for People Who Are Living in Chaos. I highly recommend that people in the church, if you haven't read it, it's really powerful stories. I was really moved by that. And it fits in perfectly, Reverend, with your sermon. Uh, some, the tragedy, very serious, others not so much, but something that touches on experiences that everybody can relate to. One of her stories, and I was really inspired by that. It was really something. I've shared her book with some of my friends too, and it was she has a lot of insights to it about when you're in chaos or bad times, how to think about it, discussion questions, and script. Oh, then also like she also put some recipes in there from some of these people who find joy in cooking and things like that. But her book would really goes along good with what your sermon is today.
Thanks, David. Was there anything in particular? Was there one story that you really liked the most that you can remember?
Uh, or actually, a lot of them stand out. There was a lady who was someone who's just basically very lonely, and like she sought comfort, and then then a couple others. There was a couple fellows who were in the war in Ukraine and seriously injured, but then they found peace and a way to work their way through like what happened to them and through all the chaos. But like when you read like an individual stories from people, they're real people just like us, and it's very encouraging to see how other people work through chaos.
Thank you, Dave.
It's a really all the stories they're not very long, but it's really powerful book, and I highly recommend it for everybody in the church.
Beautiful. And also what I love about you sharing that, David, is it's the beauty of this community.
Oh
That
yeah, we have a great
Natalia has
community.
the talent and the gift of getting that written and done and shared, and it's impacted you. And now I think all of us are going to want to get our copies of it and read it. I know we all enjoyed her presentation. So, but I love how we can help each other, and I think that's a balm what we need right now is a book like that. So thank you, and thank you, Natalia, for doing it. Any other questions, comments? Okay, well, with that, we'll wrap up our discussion today. Thank you so much.